Hi there. Tonight we're stepping back in time, not to a quiet meadow or a bustling market, but into the very heart of medieval society. A place where faith permeated every breath, every action, every thought. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit cathedral, the air thick with incense, the Latin chant echoing off stone walls, and the stern gaze of saints from painted frescoes seeming to follow your every move. You're kneeling on cold stone, surrounded by a crowd, and a pervasive sense of awe and, yes, a subtle tremor of fear washes over you, because tonight we're going to explore a less comfortable truth about the Middle Ages, why medieval women might have feared the church. You probably won't survive this era for long without accruing some serious penance. But don't worry, tonight's journey is much safer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, perhaps tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The church in the Middle Ages wasn't just a place you visited on Sundays. It was the very bedrock of existence. It governed everything from your birth to your death, dictated moral codes, held immense political power, and offered the only perceived path to salvation. For medieval women, this pervasive presence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered spiritual comfort, community, and sometimes even opportunities for influence, as we've discussed with abbesses. Remember them. On the other hand, its doctrines, its laws, and its male-dominated hierarchy often cast a long, intimidating shadow over women's lives, creating a fertile ground for apprehension and, indeed, fear. You see, the medieval church, much like medieval society itself, was deeply patriarchal. Its interpretations of scripture, its theological pronouncements, and its legal frameworks were shaped almost entirely by men, often celibate men, who had very specific, and sometimes frankly peculiar, views on women. It's a bit like having all your life's rules written by a committee of well-meaning but ultimately clueless bachelors. One mainstream historical fact is that the church held immense spiritual authority over individuals, promising eternal salvation. For adherence to its teachings, and eternal damnation for defiance. This was not a minor detail. In a deeply religious age, the fear of hellfire was a very real and potent force. For women, who were often taught to be particularly susceptible to sin, this spiritual leverage was a constant weight, a quirky tidbit. Some medieval miracle stories often featured women either as the recipients of divine intervention or as the subjects of divine punishment, serving as powerful cautionary tales to the faithful. These stories, though perhaps intended to inspire devotion, also reinforced the idea of a powerful, sometimes terrifying, God who directly intervened in human lives. Imagine hearing a tale about a woman who gossiped too much and her tongue turned black. It certainly puts a damper on casual conversation. Historians still argue whether the church deliberately used such stories to control female behavior, or if they simply reflected popular anxieties of the time. The fear wasn't necessarily of God himself, but of the church's earthly representatives and their power to interpret God's will. Priests, bishops, and inquisitors held immense sway over your spiritual fate, and their judgments could have profound real-world consequences, from public penance to excommunication, which was essentially social and spiritual death. This pervasive authority, wielded by men often wary of female influence, laid the groundwork for a nuanced but undeniable fear that permeated many medieval women's lives, building on the Church's pervasive power. One of the most fundamental reasons for this undercurrent of fear among medieval women lay in the very bedrock of Christian theology, the story of Eve and her enduring legacy. From the earliest Church Fathers, the narrative of Eve's temptation and the fall of humanity cast a long, dark shadow over the perception of women, painting them as inherently weaker, more susceptible to sin, and ultimately responsible for humanity's banishment from paradise. Imagine sitting in church, listening to a sermon delivered by a stern-faced priest. He speaks of the Garden of Eden, of the serpent's cunning, and of Eve's fatal decision to pluck the forbidden fruit. He emphasizes her curiosity, her disobedience, and her role in tempting Adam. This story, reiterated countless times from childhood, would instill a profound sense of inherited guilt and spiritual vulnerability. You, as a woman, were born into this legacy, forever bearing the mark of Eve's transgression. It's like being perpetually blamed for your ancestors' bad financial decisions, but with eternal consequences. One mainstream historical fact is that Church Fathers widely promoted the idea of female inferiority rooted in the Eve narrative. Influential theologians like Tertullian, Augustine, and Jerome wrote extensively on this topic, often portraying women as inherently carnal, less rational, and more prone to spiritual weakness than men. These views weren't just abstract theology, they filtered down into popular sermons, moral tracts, and daily conversations, shaping societal attitudes. A quirky tidbit: some medieval art, particularly carvings in cathedrals, would depict Eve with particularly seductive or even monstrous features, further reinforcing her role as a dangerous temptress. Imagine seeing a grotesque carving of Eve outside the very church you attend. It certainly sends a clear message about female nature. Historians still argue whether these artistic representations were merely allegorical or actively contributed to a misogynistic worldview among the populace. This theological interpretation had very real consequences for women. It served to justify their subservient position in society and within the Church itself. If women were inherently weaker and more prone to sin, then it logically followed in the medieval mindset, at least, that they should be subject to male authority in the home, in the community, and in spiritual matters. You were told, explicitly or implicitly, that your very nature made you a potential gateway to sin, not just for yourself, but for men. This constant reminder of Eve's fault instilled a deep-seated apprehension. It meant that every temptation, every sinful thought, every deviation from the Church's strict moral code could be traced back to this inherent weakness. The fear wasn't just of personal damnation, but of living up to this ancient, negative archetype. It created a profound psychological burden, making women wary of their own desires and instincts, viewing them through the lens of Eve's fallibility. The weight of original sin and Eve's role in it hung heavy over the lives of medieval women, stemming directly from the pervasive narrative of Eve. The concept of original sin's burden placed an especially heavy spiritual weight on medieval women. If Eve was the instrument of humanity's fall, then her female descendants were seen as carrying a particular responsibility for this primordial transgression, impacting their perceived spiritual purity and their path to salvation. Imagine a chill creeping up your spine as the priest elaborates on the consequences of original sin. Disease, suffering, and the necessity of arduous labor, all stemming from Eve's single act of disobedience. For you, a medieval woman, this wasn't just abstract theology. It was the explanation for every hardship, every pain you experienced. And you were constantly reminded that your sex, your very being, was intimately connected to this foundational flaw in humanity. It's like being perpetually reminded that your gender crashed the first computer. And now everyone has to deal with dial-up internet. One mainstream historical fact is that church teachings often emphasized the pain of childbirth as a direct punishment for Eve's sin. The book of Genesis, which states, "In pain you shall bring forth children," was frequently cited. This meant that the intense suffering inherent in childbirth, a universal experience for most medieval women, was interpreted not just as a physical ordeal but as a divinely ordained consequence. A constant reminder of ancestral guilt. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval medical texts, often influenced by church doctrine, would attribute various female ailments or perceived emotional instabilities to their inherent fallen nature, suggesting a biological predisposition to weakness or irrationality tied to Eve. Imagine having a bad day, and instead of being offered a comforting word, you're told it's just your inherited spiritual weakness acting up. Historians still argue whether this theological framing of female suffering was a form of control or a genuine attempt to explain physical realities within a religious worldview. This pervasive theological framework instilled a particular kind of fear, the fear of your own inherent imperfection, a nagging doubt about your spiritual worthiness. Every temptation, every personal failing could be seen as a manifestation of this inherited weakness. It wasn't just about individual sins, but about a collective, historical burden that women were believed to carry more profoundly than men. The remedies offered by the Church, such as baptism to wash away original sin and confession for subsequent transgressions, were crucial. But even with these sacraments, the underlying narrative persisted. You were constantly striving to overcome a flaw that was, by divine decree, part of your very essence. This created an ongoing spiritual anxiety, a fear of never quite being good enough in the eyes of God or his earthly representatives. So, the burden of original sin, interpreted through the lens of Eve's fall, cast a long and often terrifying shadow over the spiritual lives of medieval women. It underscored their perceived vulnerability, justified their subservient roles, and made the path to salvation a constant, often fearful, struggle against an inherited spiritual deficit. In stark contrast to the burdened figure of Eve, the Church presented another powerful female archetype, the Virgin Mary's ideal. While seemingly a beacon of hope and purity, this impossible standard often became another source of quiet fear and anxiety for medieval women, setting an unreachable bar for piety and virtue. Imagine you are gazing up at a stained glass window in your local church. The figure of Mary, serene and beatific, glows with ethereal light. She is depicted as pure, humble, obedient, and untouched by original sin, the ultimate antidote to Eve's transgression. She is the Mother of God, Queen of Heaven, and the embodiment of perfect womanhood. It's like being constantly compared to an Instagram influencer who not only has perfect hair, but also spontaneously generates doves and healing rainbows. 1. Mainstream historical fact is that the cult of the Virgin Mary grew immensely popular. Throughout the Middle Ages, cathedrals were dedicated to her, countless hymns and prayers composed in her honor, and her image adorned churches and homes. She became the primary intercessor between humanity and God, a compassionate figure in contrast to the sternness of Christ, the judge. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval devotional practices encouraged women to emulate Mary in their daily lives, from her quiet humility to her boundless compassion. This could involve specific prayers, acts of charity, or even adopting certain postures or manners. Imagine trying to get through a busy day of churning butter and mending clothes while constantly striving for the serene, otherworldly grace of the Virgin Mary. Historians still argue whether the veneration of Mary genuinely elevated the status of women or simply reinforced an unattainable ideal that further pressured them. For medieval women, Mary was simultaneously a source of comfort and a daunting challenge. She represented the pinnacle of female virtue, a pathway to holiness. But how could any mortal woman, burdened by original sin and the realities of earthly life, ever hope to measure up to such an immaculate standard? The fear wasn't of Mary herself, but of falling short, of being unable to embody even a fraction of her perfect piety. This ideal implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, highlighted female shortcomings. If Mary was the model, then ordinary women, with their worldly desires, their physical bodies, and their everyday struggles, were inherently imperfect. This could foster a sense of inadequacy, a quiet anxiety about one's spiritual standing. You might pray fervently to Mary, seeking her intercession, while simultaneously feeling acutely aware of your own perceived flaws when measured against her flawless image. The Virgin Mary offered hope and intercession, but her immaculate perfection also cast a long shadow. For medieval women, she was a divine aspiration, yet also a constant reminder of their inherent human fallibility, creating a subtle but persistent fear of never being truly worthy in the eyes of the Church, or, ultimately, God. Beyond grand theological ideals, the Church's authority seeped into the most intimate corners of a medieval woman's life through the practice of confession and control. The confessional booth, or simply a private conversation with a priest, became a powerful tool for moral regulation, often instilling a quiet fear of judgment and the revelation of one's deepest sins. Imagine kneeling in the dim light of a church, perhaps a small, enclosed space, or simply before your parish priest. You're preparing to confess your sins, to lay bare your conscience before a man who holds the keys to your spiritual well-being. This wasn't just a casual chat. It was a sacrament, a moment of profound vulnerability where every transgression, every impure thought could be exposed. And for medieval women, whose lives were constantly scrutinized, the thought of revealing personal failings could be particularly daunting. It's like having a mandatory performance review with someone who can literally send you to hell if they don't like your answers. One mainstream historical fact is that the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated annual confession and communion for all adult Christians. This decree significantly increased the Church's oversight of individual morality. Priests were expected to instruct penitents on sins, administer penance, and ensure adherence to Church doctrine, turning confession into a regular, systematic tool of social and spiritual control. A quirky tidbit: some medieval confessional manuals included incredibly detailed lists of potential sins, often with specific sections dedicated to sins of women or particular female transgressions. These could range from vanity and gossiping to improper sexual thoughts or even using charms. For fertility, imagine reading a list of all the ways you could accidentally displease God, and half of them seem specifically designed for your gender. Historians still argue whether the detailed nature of these manuals reflected genuine pastoral concern or a desire to exert stricter control over female morality. The fear wasn't just of eternal damnation, though that was certainly part of it. It was also the fear of earthly consequences. A priest might impose public penance, like standing in sackcloth, or require arduous pilgrimages, He might reveal your sins to your husband or family if he deemed it necessary for moral correction, shattering your reputation. This power dynamic, where a male cleric held judgment over your most intimate thoughts and actions, could be a source of profound anxiety. Furthermore, the confessional was often a place where societal norms were reinforced. A woman might be questioned about her marital fidelity, her obedience to her husband, her practices during childbirth, or her use of traditional remedies that might be deemed superstitious. It was a space where the Church's patriarchal views on proper female behavior were subtly, or sometimes overtly, imposed. So, the sacrament of confession, while offering the promise of absolution and spiritual guidance, also served as a powerful instrument of control. For medieval women, it instilled a quiet but pervasive fear of scrutiny, judgment, and the potentially devastating earthly and spiritual consequences of falling short of the Church's exacting moral standards. Flowing directly from the confessional's intimate scrutiny, the Church's teachings on sinful pleasures and female temptation created a constant undercurrent of fear for medieval women. Their very bodies and natural desires were often presented as sources of spiritual danger, not just for themselves, but as snares for men. Imagine hearing a sermon that equates beautiful hair or alluring clothing with the devil's work, subtly hinting that your natural attractiveness could lead men astray, and thus condemn your own soul. You are told that the world is full of temptations, and your female nature, inherited from Eve, makes you particularly susceptible to both experiencing and being temptation. It's like being given a superpower that only works to accidentally cause chaos, and you're constantly warned about it. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval church doctrine often viewed sexual desire, even within marriage, with suspicion. While marriage was a sacrament for procreation, clerical writers frequently warned against carnal pleasure for its own sake, associating it more strongly with female lust. This meant women were often held accountable for inciting sinful thoughts in men, regardless of their own intentions. A quirky tidbit: some medieval moral treatises would depict personified vices, with luxury or lust often taking the form of a seductive, richly dressed woman, complete with flowing hair and revealing garments. These visual and literary tropes reinforce the idea that female beauty and sensuality were inherently dangerous and needed to be controlled. Imagine seeing a literal diagram of sin, and the biggest arrow points directly at your gender. Historians still argue whether these portrayals truly reflected popular medieval attitudes or were primarily the anxieties of celibate male clergy. This pervasive teaching instilled a profound fear of your own physicality and your natural desires. Simple acts of vanity, like admiring yourself in a polished mirror or feeling a flicker of attraction, could be interpreted as a step towards spiritual damnation. You are constantly policing your thoughts, your appearance, and your interactions to ensure you weren't succumbing to sinful pleasures or, worse, causing a man to succumb. The implications extended to everyday life. Modest dress was not just a societal norm but a religious imperative. Public displays of affection were frowned upon. Any unchaperoned interaction with men could lead to accusations of impropriety. The Church's teachings created a constant anxiety about self-control and the purity of one's intentions, with women carrying a disproportionate burden of this moral responsibility. Thus, the Church's focus on sinful pleasures and the particular susceptibility of women to temptation generated a pervasive fear that permeated the medieval woman's daily existence. It forced a constant vigilance over her own body, her desires, and her interactions. lest she fall prey to perceived spiritual dangers or, worse, lead others down a path to damnation. While the Church condemned sinful pleasures, it also presented the seemingly virtuous path of marriage as a sacrament. However, even this holy union, ordained and controlled by the Church, became a source of profound fear for medieval women, dictating their lives and often limiting their choices within rigid, often unforgiving, legal and spiritual frameworks. Imagine the day of your wedding, a ceremony not just sanctioned but actively orchestrated by the Church. The priest presides, blessing your union, reminding you of your vows and your duties. This isn't just a social contract, it's a sacred bond, an unbreakable covenant blessed by God. But within this divine blessing lay a cage, subtly constructed from theological dictates and canon law. It's like getting a fancy new gilded birdcage for your birthday, and then realizing you're the bird. One mainstream historical fact is that the Church gradually asserted its exclusive jurisdiction over marriage. By the High Middle Ages, marriage was firmly recognized as one of the 7 sacraments. This meant that the Church, not just local custom or secular lords, had the ultimate authority to define valid marriages, arbitrate disputes, and legislate on marital conduct. This centralized control gave the Church immense power over women's lives. Quirky tidbit: medieval canon law was incredibly specific about what constituted a valid marriage, down to the exact words exchanged. If the words weren't right, or if there was a pre-existing contract, the marriage could be annulled, potentially leaving a woman without social standing or legitimate children. Imagine discovering your entire life's foundation was built on a legal loophole because your husband mumbled a vow. Historians still argue whether the Church's strict rules on marriage were primarily about moral purity or about consolidating its own legal authority. The fear here stemmed from the absolute and often unforgiving nature of Church law. Once married, you were bound for life. Divorce, as we understand it today, was virtually impossible. While separation might be granted in extreme cases, the marital bond itself remained indissoluble. This meant if you were trapped in an unhappy, abusive, or simply incompatible marriage, there was little to no escape provided by the Church. Your fate was sealed, often by promises made as a young girl. Furthermore, the Church dictated the roles within marriage. The wife's obedience to her husband was a key tenet, mirroring the obedience of the Church to Christ. Disobedience could be framed as a sin, making defiance not just a domestic issue, but a spiritual transgression. Your submission was a virtue, your autonomy a potential vice. Thus, while marriage was presented as a blessed path to salvation and stability, the Church's tight grip on its definition and enforcement created significant fear for medieval women. It bound them to lifelong unions, often with little recourse, and reinforced patriarchal power structures, all under the guise of divine will. Directly linked to the Church's sacramental control over marriage was the formidable concept of indissolubility of marriage. This doctrine, which declared a valid, consummated marriage as unbreakable, was a source of profound fear for medieval women, often trapping them in situations that offered little escape or hope for betterment. Imagine you're a young woman, perhaps barely a teenager, standing before the altar. You exchange vows, words that seem simple enough, but which the Church teaches are literally binding until death. There's no prenup, no trial period, and absolutely no easy exit strategy. If your husband turns out to be cruel, neglectful, or simply intolerable, the Church's answer is largely to endure it, to pray for strength, and to consider your suffering as a path to salvation. It's like signing a lifetime contract for a job, only to discover your boss is a dragon, and quitting isn't an option. One mainstream historical fact is that divorce, in the modern sense, did not exist in medieval canon law. While declarations that a marriage was never valid to begin with, usually due to technicalities like pre-existing contracts, consanguinity, or non-consummation, were possible. They were rare, expensive, and difficult to obtain, generally only accessible to the very wealthy or powerful. For the vast majority of ordinary women, an unhappy marriage was a life sentence. A quirky tidbit: some desperate medieval women sought informal separations, simply fleeing abusive situations or living apart from their husbands, but this put them in a precarious legal and social position. They could be accused of desertion, lose rights to property, and face social ostracism. Imagine becoming a runaway wife. It's less like an empowering journey of self-discovery, and more like a constant struggle for survival on the fringes of society. Historians still argue whether the Church's strict stance on indissolubility, despite its hardships, provided some stability for women by ensuring their husbands couldn't easily abandon them. The fear for medieval women wasn't just physical abuse, though that was a grim reality for many. It was also the fear of emotional isolation, of spiritual despair, and of knowing that your future was irrevocably tied to a person over whom you had little control, and from whom the Church offered no escape. Your path to salvation often lay through enduring your divinely ordained suffering within marriage. Furthermore, issues like spousal debt or criminal behavior by the husband could indirectly impact the wife, and the Church's laws often did little to protect her from these consequences. While some legal systems offered separate property rights for married women in certain circumstances, the overarching Church doctrine of marital unity meant the wife's legal identity was largely subsumed by her husband's. So, the Church's doctrine of marriage indissolubility, while offering spiritual sanctity to the institution, simultaneously trapped medieval women in unions they could not escape. It was a source of profound, pervasive fear, knowing that a single vow could bind them to a lifetime of hardship, with the Church's authority actively preventing any legal recourse. Beyond the spiritual bond, the Church's influence permeated the very practical arrangements of medieval marriage, particularly concerning dowries and church law. While a dowry was a secular custom, the Church's involvement in marriage meant its rules and attitudes subtly, but powerfully, shaped how these financial arrangements impacted women, often creating fear around their security and future. Imagine your family gathering, discussing your future. The central topic isn't your happiness or compatibility with a potential husband, but the size of the dowry, the property or money your family provides to your husband upon marriage. This wasn't just a gift. It was often intended to support you within the marriage, and theoretically to be returned to you or your family if the marriage ended due to your husband's death or an annulment. The Church, in its role of overseeing the sacrament of marriage, had a vested interest in the proper handling of these funds. It's like a medieval prenuptial agreement, but handled by the clergy, who had very strong opinions on what counted as fair and square. One mainstream historical fact is that the Church generally advocated for the protection of a woman's dowry rights. While the husband often gained control of the dowry upon marriage, canon law frequently stipulated that the dowry was the wife's property, intended for her support, and should be returned upon the dissolution of the marriage by death or annulment. This stance was intended to protect women, especially widows, from destitution. A quirky tidbit: Some medieval legal disputes brought before church courts involved women seeking the return of their dowries after their husbands had squandered them, or died without providing for their wives. These cases could be protracted and emotionally draining, forcing women to publicly air their financial grievances and revealing the precariousness of their economic security within marriage. Imagine having to sue your late husband's family to get back what was rightfully yours. It's a bit like battling an army of medieval accountants. Historians still argue whether the church's interventions in dowry disputes were genuinely protective of women or primarily aimed at upholding the sanctity of the marital contract. The fear, however, stemmed from the practical realities. While church law offered theoretical protection, actually enforcing your rights to a dowry could be incredibly difficult. If your husband died penniless, or if his family refused to return the funds, your recourse was limited. You might be left destitute, despite the church's good intentions. The legal process itself could be intimidating, expensive, and protracted, often requiring you to navigate complex ecclesiastical courts. Furthermore, the pressure to provide a substantial dowry could be immense, particularly for families with multiple daughters. Failure to secure an adequate dowry could mean an undesirable marriage, or no marriage at all, pushing a woman towards an unchosen single life or a religious vocation for which she felt no calling. The church, by making marriage a sacrament and by providing legal frameworks for dowries, inadvertently tied a woman's fate to these often stressful financial negotiations. While the church aimed to provide some security through its dowry regulations, the actual implementation often created fear for medieval women. Their financial futures, their social standing, and their very eligibility for marriage were inextricably linked to these arrangements, all under the watchful and often demanding eye of church law. The church's intricate web of influence extended beyond valid marriages to cast a severe, terrifying shadow over women who conceived outside its sanctioned bonds, manifesting in the deep stigma of illegitimacy. For medieval women, bearing a child out of wedlock was a source of profound fear, leading to harsh societal judgment, economic ruin, and spiritual condemnation. Imagine a young woman in medieval society suddenly facing the reality of an unsanctioned pregnancy. The whispers would start almost immediately, the pointing fingers, the judgmental glances. There were no anonymous hospitals or discreet social services. Her sin was made flesh, visible for all to see. The fear wasn't just of public shame. It was a profound, existential terror of being cast out, losing all social standing, and facing a life of destitution for herself and her child. It's like having your biggest, most private mistake broadcast on every town crier's daily news report, with no chance to change the channel. One mainstream historical fact is that illegitimacy carried immense social and legal penalties in medieval Europe, heavily reinforced by church doctrine. Children born out of wedlock were often denied inheritance rights, access to guilds, and could face significant discrimination throughout their lives. For the mother, the moral condemnation from the church was swift and severe, often involving public penance, exclusion from sacraments, and the burden of eternal damnation unless profound repentance was shown. A quirky tidbit: some desperate women resorted to infanticide, a crime that, if discovered, brought the harshest possible punishments, including execution. The immense pressure and societal condemnation often pushed women to unthinkable extremes to avoid the public shame and destitution associated with an illegitimate child. Imagine the sheer terror and despair that would lead a woman to such a desperate act. Historians still argue whether the Church's severe moral condemnation, while aiming to enforce chastity, inadvertently led to more tragic outcomes for desperate women. The fear was multi-layered. Firstly, there was the spiritual fear. The Church taught that fornication was a grave sin, and unrepented, it could lead directly to hell. Secondly, the social fear. You would be ostracized by your community, perhaps even disowned by your family. Your chances of a respectable marriage would vanish. Thirdly, the economic fear. Without a husband, supporting a child as a single woman was incredibly difficult, often forcing women into desperate poverty or prostitution. Church courts, which had jurisdiction over moral matters, could compel women to reveal the father's identity or publicly confess their sin. The process itself was humiliating, and the outcome often left the woman in an even more vulnerable position. While some charities, often run by religious orders, existed to care for abandoned children, they were few and far between, and their existence did little to alleviate the mother's immediate predicament. Thus, the Church's relentless condemnation of illegitimacy and its harsh enforcement of sexual morality instilled a profound and terrifying fear in medieval women. The prospect of bearing a child outside of marriage was not just a social blunder, it was a spiritual catastrophe with devastating earthly consequences, pushing many to the brink of despair. As the medieval period progressed, the quiet fear of the Church's moral judgment escalated into a terrifying visceral dread for countless women with the terrifying rise of witchcraft accusations. What began as theological suspicion eventually metastasized into a widespread panic, casting women as the primary targets of an insidious, deadly persecution orchestrated, or at least sanctioned, by the Church. Imagine a sudden knock on your door, or a whisper in the marketplace. Someone has fallen ill, a cow has died, or a neighbor's crop has failed, and fingers are beginning to point. And then the terrifying accusation, which for you, a medieval woman, this wasn't just idle gossip, it was a death sentence waiting to happen, fueled by superstition, fear, and the Church's growing obsession with rooting out heresy and demonic influence. It's like suddenly being declared the source of all bad luck in town. But instead of just being shunned, you're now facing a very literal trial by fire. One mainstream historical fact is that the concept of witchcraft as a diabolical pact, requiring the systematic eradication of witches, gained significant traction in the late Middle Ages, especially with the publication of texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. In the late 15th century, this infamous manual, written by Dominican inquisitors, specifically targeted women, portraying them as inherently weaker and more susceptible to the devil's temptations than men. A quirky tidbit: some women who were accused of witchcraft were often those who lived independently, or were healers, midwives, or simply older, unmarried women who didn't fit neatly into traditional social structures. Their perceived deviance or unique knowledge made them easy targets for suspicion. Imagine being the village expert on herbal remedies. Remember those useful skills, only to have your knowledge turned against you as evidence of dark magic. Historians still argue whether the witch hunts were primarily driven by misogyny, social anxieties about independent women, or genuine theological beliefs about demonic conspiracy. The fear was paralyzing. Once accused, due process as we understand, it was often non-existent. Confessions were frequently extracted through torture, and spectral evidence, dreams, or visions of the accused was accepted in some courts. You might find yourself subjected to brutal interrogations, designed to break your will and force you to admit to impossible acts. The Church, through its inquisitors and by legitimizing the witch hunts, provided the intellectual and spiritual framework for these atrocities. This fear wasn't just for yourself. It was for your daughters, your sisters, your friends. The shadow of accusation hung over entire communities, leading to paranoia and suspicion. Simply having an argument with a neighbor, or being too outspoken, could be enough to invite scrutiny. The Church, by framing witchcraft as the ultimate heresy, effectively weaponized fear against women, transforming everyday anxieties into a terrifying spiritual crusade. Thus, the rise of witchcraft accusations, fueled by theological interpretations and sanctioned by powerful church figures, became one of the most terrifying manifestations of the Church's power over medieval women. It transformed vague anxieties into concrete, deadly threats, leaving an indelible mark of fear on the collective female consciousness. Directly following the terrifying specter of witchcraft accusations, we delve deeper into the mechanisms of fear. Inquisitorial justice. The Church's formal judicial arm, the Inquisition, while designed to root out heresy, employed methods that were particularly brutal and disproportionately harmful to women, instilling a chilling dread far beyond mere spiritual anxiety. Imagine being brought before an inquisitor. The room is quiet, perhaps with only the rustle of parchment and the low voices of clerks. But the atmosphere is heavy with unspoken menace. There's no public trial, no jury of your peers. Your accusers might be anonymous, your fate decided by a cleric who believes he is acting directly on God's behalf. And if you are a woman, particularly one outside the traditional patriarchal protections, you are often seen as inherently weaker, more prone to heresy, or, as we've discussed, to witchcraft. It's like facing a judge who already assumes you're guilty, and your only defense is to hope for a miracle or a very, very strong constitution. One mainstream historical fact is that the Inquisition's procedures allowed for the use of torture to extract confessions, while not universally applied, and often with caveats like not causing permanent injury. A rule frequently ignored. The threat and application of torture were terrifyingly effective. Women, often physically less robust than men, and sometimes emotionally more susceptible to psychological pressure, were particularly vulnerable to coerced confessions under these conditions. A quirky tidbit: a significant percentage of those prosecuted by the Inquisition for witchcraft or heresy were women, especially those who were healers, widows, or simply lived independently. Their nonconformity to societal norms made them easy targets for suspicion in the eyes of inquisitors looking for convenient scapegoats. Imagine having your independent life interpreted as evidence of a pact with dark forces, simply because you don't fit into a neat little box. Historians still argue whether the Inquisition's focus on women in witch trials stemmed from pre-existing misogyny or evolved organically from their methods of identifying and prosecuting heretics. The fear generated by inquisitorial justice was multifaceted. Firstly, there was the arbitrary nature of the accusations. Neighbors, grudges, misinterpreted words, or even strange dreams could lead to an accusation. Secondly, the secrecy of the proceedings meant you had little recourse or knowledge of the charges against you until it was too late. Thirdly, the focus on confession meant that the ultimate goal was not necessarily to find truth, but to extract an admission of guilt, often leading to false self-incrimination. For women, the inquisitorial process was a profound violation. The interrogations often delved into intimate details of their lives, their bodies, and their sexual histories, all under the guise of rooting out spiritual impurity. The punishment, whether imprisonment, public penance, or death by burning for unrepentant heretics or convicted witches, served as a chilling deterrent for anyone contemplating defying church authority or simply living a life that was perceived as unconventional. Thus the cold, methodical reach of inquisitorial justice instilled a deep and abiding fear in medieval women. It was a terrifying reminder of the Church's ultimate power over their bodies, their souls, and their very existence, reducing them to vulnerable targets in a relentless spiritual war. In stark contrast to the perils of heresy, the Church offered what seemed like a safe harbor, the convent. Yet, for many medieval women, the convent's nature as either a refuge or a prison was a complex reality, often instilling a quiet fear of limited choice, enforced piety, or a life unchosen. Imagine yourself standing before the imposing gates of a medieval abbey, the massive wooden doors, the high walls, and the somber silence. For some, this represented a sanctuary, a place of spiritual solace, intellectual pursuit, and genuine devotion. For others, however, it was a place of last resort, a destiny imposed by family circumstance, political maneuvering, or the inability to secure a suitable marriage. It's like being offered a 5-star hotel room, but you're not allowed to check out, ever, even if the minibar is stocked with only prayer beads. One mainstream historical fact is that convents provided one of the few avenues for medieval women to receive an education and pursue intellectual endeavors. Within their walls, nuns learned to read, write, and often engaged in scholarly pursuits, copying manuscripts, composing hymns, and studying theology. This intellectual freedom was largely unavailable to laywomen. A quirky tidbit: some aristocratic families would send daughters with physical disabilities or those deemed unmarriageable to convents, not for spiritual calling, but as a practical solution to avoid the burden of a dowry or to maintain family honor. These women might live out their lives within the cloister, regardless of their personal desires. Imagine being sent to the nunnery because you have a limp, rather than a divine revelation. Historians still argue whether the primary function of medieval convents was spiritual devotion or a convenient social institution for managing unmarried women. The fear for women entering convents stemmed from several sources. Firstly, the irrevocable nature of the vows. Once taken, vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience bound a woman for life. There was no going back to the secular world, no chance for marriage or a family of her own, even if her circumstances outside the convent changed dramatically. This permanent commitment could be terrifying if it wasn't freely chosen. Secondly, the loss of personal autonomy. While abbesses held power, individual nuns lived under strict rules, their days rigidly structured by prayer, work, and communal living. Personal property was surrendered, and individual desires were subsumed by the will of the community and the abbess. For women who valued independence, this could feel stifling. Finally, there was the fear of forced entry or lack of genuine vocation. To live a life of spiritual devotion without a true calling, confined within a rigid structure, could lead to profound spiritual and emotional distress. The fear was not just of the Church's authority, but of being trapped in a life that offered no personal fulfillment, only endless, uninspired duty. Thus, while convents offered a protected space for women in the Middle Ages, their role as a refuge was often intertwined with the fear of compulsion, lifelong commitment, and the suppression of individual choice, making them, for some, a gilded cage rather than a true sanctuary. Beyond the direct accusations of witchcraft and the chilling methods of the Inquisition, medieval women also faced profound fear if they became involved in heretical movements. While some women were drawn to alternative spiritual paths, seeking greater agency or spiritual fulfillment, this defiance of Orthodox Church doctrine came with terrifying consequences, often enforced with extreme brutality. Imagine a whispered conversation in a hidden cellar or a secret gathering in a secluded forest. You've heard of groups that interpret the Bible differently, that reject the authority of corrupt priests, or that preach a simpler, purer form of Christianity. For some women, these movements, like the Cathars or Waldensians, offered a sense of equality, intellectual engagement, and spiritual directness often denied by the mainstream church. But joining them meant stepping into a perilous world where faith could be a death sentence. It's like joining a clandestine book club where the reading list is forbidden, and the penalty for membership is public incineration. One mainstream historical fact is that women played significant roles in many medieval heretical movements, both as followers and as active preachers or spiritual leaders. For instance, among the Cathars in southern France, women could achieve high spiritual status as perfects, leading ascetic lives and ministering to others, a role denied to them in the Catholic Church. This visibility, however, also made them prime targets for persecution. A quirky tidbit: some inquisitorial records detail elaborate networks of women who secretly passed on heretical teachings, hid forbidden texts, or provided refuge for persecuted members of these movements. They formed an underground resistance, demonstrating remarkable courage in the face of immense danger. Imagine orchestrating a secret chain of safe houses, all while pretending to be a perfectly ordinary, devout villager. Historians still argue whether women's disproportionate involvement in some heretical sects was due to greater spiritual yearning or a reaction against the restrictive roles imposed by the Orthodox Church. The fear for women involved in these movements was visceral and constant. The Church viewed heresy as a deadly spiritual disease, threatening the very fabric of Christendom. The Inquisition, as we've discussed, was specifically designed to crush such dissent. If discovered, you faced interrogation, torture, confiscation of property, imprisonment, and ultimately, if you refused to recant or relapsed, death by burning at the stake. The stories of women martyred for their faith in these movements served as terrifying cautionary tales, even as they inspired others. The very act of questioning church dogma, or seeking a more direct relationship with God outside of the established hierarchy, was deemed a grave sin, pushing women into the most perilous forms of defiance. Thus, while heretical movements offered an alluring promise of spiritual liberation for medieval women, they were fraught with immense danger. The Church's brutal suppression of dissent instilled a profound and terrifying fear, ensuring that any deviation from orthodoxy came with the ultimate, horrifying cost within the seemingly sheltered walls of convents. The dynamic between abbesses and patriarchs often became a surprising battleground, generating a different kind of fear for female monastic leaders. While abbesses could wield immense power, their authority was constantly challenged by the male-dominated hierarchy of the Church, creating an ongoing tension that underscored the precariousness of female leadership. Imagine you are an abbess, the head of a wealthy and influential convent. You manage vast estates, command a sizable workforce, oversee significant finances, and are responsible for the spiritual well-being of hundreds of nuns. You are, in effect, a powerful feudal lord, answering directly to the Pope or a distant bishop rather than a local lord. But despite your immense responsibilities and your spiritual authority, you are still a woman, operating within a church structure designed and governed almost entirely by men. It's like being the CEO of a major company, but all your board members constantly question your decisions just because you wear a skirt. One mainstream historical fact is that many powerful medieval abbesses held significant temporal, secular power, including rights of justice over their lands and the ability to send representatives to royal courts. These women effectively governed territories, collected taxes, and administered law, functions typically reserved for male lords. This gave them a real-world influence that sometimes rivaled local bishops or counts. A quirky tidbit: some abbesses fiercely resisted attempts by male bishops or local lords to exert control over their convents, invoking papal bulls or ancient charters to defend their autonomy. These battles could be protracted and acrimonious, requiring formidable legal and political skill from the abbesses. Imagine an abbess locking the gates of her convent, refusing entry to an unwelcome bishop, citing obscure canon law in Latin. Historians still argue whether the Church's granting of such temporal power to abbesses was a genuine recognition of their capabilities or a pragmatic strategy to manage vast estates through a trusted, often celibate, female intermediary. The fear for abbesses stemmed from this constant struggle for authority. They faced the threat of male interference in their spiritual and temporal affairs, attempts to assert patriarchal control over their finances, or even efforts to suppress their communities entirely. Their power, though substantial, was always conditional and subject to the whims of male prelates, who often viewed female authority with suspicion or outright hostility. Furthermore, the Church's general prohibition on female ordination meant that even the most powerful abbess could not administer sacraments, preach publicly to men, or hold the same liturgical authority as a male priest. This fundamental theological limitation underscored their subordinate position within the larger church hierarchy, a constant reminder of the glass ceiling, medieval style. Thus, while leading a convent offered medieval single women a unique path to power for abbesses, this power was often tempered by a pervasive fear of male encroachment and the constant struggle to defend their hard-won autonomy against the overwhelming patriarchal forces of the Church. Their leadership was a testament to their strength, but also to the ever-present threat of their authority being undermined. Stepping outside the convent's walls, another profound fear for medieval women centered on the very act of childbirth and its link to damnation. The Church's theological interpretations often imbued this natural process with spiritual peril, making a woman's most fundamental biological function a source of acute anxiety and dread. Imagine a woman in labor, writhing in pain, surrounded by sympathetic but often helpless female attendants. This agonizing ordeal, common to nearly all medieval women who married, was not just a physical struggle for survival. It was deeply intertwined with the Church's teachings on original sin. Every contraction, every cry, could be seen as a direct consequence of Eve's disobedience, reinforcing the idea that pain in childbirth was a divinely ordained punishment. It's like enduring the most excruciating physical challenge of your life, while simultaneously being reminded that it's all your fault, or at least your ancestors'. One mainstream historical fact is that Church doctrine explicitly linked childbirth pain to Eve's curse in Genesis 3:16. I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. This biblical verse was frequently cited in sermons and devotional texts, firmly establishing the theological framework for the suffering inherent in labor. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical and theological texts suggested that women who died in childbirth might face spiritual jeopardy, particularly if they had not recently confessed their sins, or if the child was stillborn and thus unbaptized. This added a terrifying spiritual dimension to an already life-threatening physical event. Imagine dying in labor, and your last thoughts are not of your baby, but of whether your soul is doomed. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on this link was primarily intended to explain suffering or to reinforce the spiritual control over women's bodies and lives. The fear for medieval women during childbirth was multifaceted. Firstly, the overwhelming physical danger. Maternal mortality rates were incredibly high, with infections, hemorrhage, and complications from difficult births claiming countless lives. The knowledge that each birth could be her last was a constant, terrifying companion. Secondly, the spiritual peril of dying unconfessed or with an unbaptized child. In a deeply Christian society, the salvation of one's soul and the child's soul was paramount. Women often made confession before or during labor, desperate to be spiritually prepared for death. The anxiety over the child's unbaptized status, if it died in the womb or immediately after birth, was profound, as infant damnation was a real fear. Finally, there was the shame of complications or stillbirth. While outwardly seen as tragedy, there could be a subtle undertone of divine displeasure, or even a hint of uncleanliness for women who had difficult labors or bore dead infants. The Church's pronouncements, while offering solace, also subtly reinforced these anxieties. Thus, childbirth, a seemingly natural and joyous event, was for medieval women steeped in fear, the fear of death, the fear of spiritual damnation, and the enduring burden of Eve's curse, all amplified by the Church's pervasive theological interpretations. Following the anxieties surrounding childbirth, the Church's deep discomfort with female physicality itself created another pervasive fear for medieval women. Their bodies, particularly their reproductive functions and natural desires, were often viewed with suspicion, deemed impure, or seen as a source of temptation, leading to a profound sense of self-consciousness and apprehension. Imagine moving through your day, acutely aware that your very physical being, your menstruation, your capacity for procreation, is sometimes seen through a lens of spiritual danger. The Church, heavily influenced by ascetic ideals and certain interpretations of ancient texts, often emphasized the corruptibility of the flesh and the spiritual superiority of the soul. And for women, the flesh was considered particularly problematic, a constant source of potential sin. It's like living in a society where half the population is secretly convinced your body parts are actually portals to a slightly less savory dimension. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval Church canon law imposed various restrictions on women during menstruation or after childbirth, such as temporary exclusion from receiving communion or entering sacred spaces. While rooted in Old Testament purity laws, these regulations reinforced the idea of female ritual impurity, contributing to a sense of unworthiness or separation from divine grace. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical theories, influenced by Church thought, suggested that women were inherently colder and wetter than men, making them more prone to emotional instability and less rational thought. This biological determinism, often tied back to Eve's supposed weakness, further justified male dominance and female subservience, contributing to a pervasive sense of female inferiority. Imagine being told your mood swings are simply due to your internal temperature being off, and it's all part of a divine plan. Historians still argue whether these theories were genuine attempts at scientific understanding or merely served to reinforce existing patriarchal structures. The fear generated by this discomfort with female physicality was subtle but profound. It could manifest as anxiety about one's natural bodily functions, viewing them as something to be hidden or even ashamed of. It fostered a vigilance over one's own desires, knowing they could be interpreted as lustful or carnal by a watchful church. The ideal was often presented as purity and asceticism, a difficult standard for anyone, but particularly challenging for women whose lives were inherently tied to the physical realities of childbearing and domesticity. This fear also influenced perceptions of female beauty. While appreciated, it was often simultaneously condemned as a potential trap for men, leading to warnings against vanity and overt adornment. A woman was implicitly and sometimes explicitly taught to fear her own attractiveness, lest it lead others or herself into sin. Thus, the Church's pervasive discomfort with female physicality instilled a deep-seated fear in medieval women. It made them wary of their own bodies, their desires, and their natural functions, viewing them through a lens of potential spiritual danger and contributing to a pervasive sense of inadequacy in the face of an often impossible ideal of purity. Moving beyond the internal fears surrounding physicality, let's consider the external dangers medieval women faced on journeys of pilgrimages and peril. While offering spiritual merit, traveling in the Middle Ages was inherently risky, and for women, especially unchaperoned, the Church's encouragement of such journeys often clashed with the very real threats to their safety and reputation. Imagine embarking on a long journey, perhaps to the shrine of a local saint, or even, for the truly intrepid, to distant Rome or Santiago de Compostela. The road is dusty, full of strangers, and lined with dense forests or remote stretches. You are on foot, reliant on the kindness of strangers, and without the protection of family or armed guards. For you, a medieval woman, the spiritual reward was immense, but the journey itself was a terrifying leap into the unknown, fraught with dangers that the Church implicitly sanctioned by promoting pilgrimage. It's like going on a spiritual retreat that doubles as a high-stakes scavenger hunt, where the treasure is salvation and the obstacles are actual brigands. One mainstream historical fact is that pilgrimage routes were notorious for various dangers, including robbery, assault, and exposure to disease. While hospices and monasteries along the way offered some shelter, they were not always secure, and the vast stretches between them were left to the pilgrim's own resilience. For women, the risk of sexual assault was a constant, terrifying concern. A quirky tidbit: some medieval miracle stories about pilgrims specifically recount divine intervention to protect women from harm during their journeys, often from bandits or lecherous men. While meant to inspire faith, these stories also subtly highlighted the very real perils women faced on the road, suggesting that divine favor was often their only true shield. Imagine needing a divine bodyguard just to walk from one town to the next without incident. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on pilgrimage was primarily for spiritual enrichment, or also served to promote social control by encouraging collective, observable acts of piety. The fear for medieval women on pilgrimage was much. There was the obvious physical danger, the threat of violence, theft, and the very real possibility of getting lost or succumbing to illness far from home. Without a male protector, a woman was significantly more vulnerable, a beacon for those with ill intent. Then there was the fear for her reputation. Traveling alone or with mixed company could invite suspicion, leading to rumors of impropriety. Even reaching her destination safely didn't guarantee her virtue would remain unquestioned upon her return. The Church, while glorifying pilgrimage, also maintained strict moral codes that could easily be breached or perceived to be breached by a woman on the road. Finally, there was the spiritual risk of not completing the vow. Many pilgrimages were undertaken as penance or in fulfillment of a solemn vow. Failing to complete the journey due to illness, mishap, or simply fear could lead to spiritual anxiety and a sense of having failed God. Thus, while pilgrimage offered a powerful spiritual avenue for medieval women, it was a journey often steeped in fear. The allure of divine grace was constantly tempered by the very real dangers of the road, the threat to their physical safety, and the ever-present shadow cast over their reputation, all within a context where the Church encouraged the journey but offered little practical protection. Moving from the perils of travel, let's explore how the Church's views permeated the very fabric of daily physical existence, influencing medical practices and remedies for medieval women. Their well-being was often seen through a spiritual lens, leading to a complex interplay of folk medicine, rudimentary medical knowledge, and fear of Church disapproval for anything deemed unorthodox or superstitious. Imagine you're feeling unwell, perhaps a persistent cough or a debilitating fever. Your first thought isn't of a sterile clinic. Instead, you might rely on the wisdom of an older woman in your village who knows about herbs, or a visit to a local shrine for a miraculous cure. But in the back of your mind, there's always a subtle apprehension. Will this remedy be seen as legitimate, or will it be deemed superstitious or even magical by the Church, potentially jeopardizing your soul? It's like having a persistent cough, and your doctor's advice is a mix of legitimate medicine, ancient folklore, and a stern warning about avoiding anything that might upset the local priest. 1. Mainstream. Historical fact is that formal medical education was largely restricted to men and often influenced by classical texts and a rudimentary understanding of anatomy. For most medieval women, access to such physicians was limited by cost and availability. Instead, they relied heavily on female healers, midwives, and a vast body of inherited folk knowledge concerning herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, and practical nursing. A quirky tidbit: some medieval church councils or local bishops issued decrees against charming or superstitious practices, which often targeted traditional female healers or those who used non-conscient methods to alleviate pain during childbirth or illness. These decrees, while aimed at stamping out pagan remnants, could instill fear in women who were simply trying to alleviate suffering using the only knowledge available to them. Imagine being threatened with excommunication for simply trying to soothe a baby's colic with a traditional lullaby and a special herb. Historians still argue whether the Church's opposition to certain folk remedies was genuinely about rooting out heresy or an attempt to control spheres of influence traditionally dominated by women. The fear for medieval women concerning their medical care stemmed from this uneasy relationship. If you sought help from a local wise woman, you risked being associated with practices the Church might condemn. If you used certain amulets or recited specific incantations, even for healing purposes, you could be accused of witchcraft, as we discussed, a truly terrifying prospect. The line between accepted spiritual healing, like praying to a saint, and condemned Superstition was often blurry and subject to interpretation by local clerics. Furthermore, the Church's emphasis on suffering as a path to salvation, remember, the link to Eve and childbirth, could make seeking pain relief seem almost sacrilegious. While not universally enforced, this theological undertone could add a layer of guilt and apprehension to a woman's desire for physical comfort or recovery. Thus, a medieval woman's efforts to maintain her health were often shadowed by fear. She navigated a complex landscape of traditional knowledge, limited formal medicine, and the ever-present threat of church disapproval, making every choice about her well-being a delicate balance between physical need and spiritual safety. Beyond the confines of personal ailments, the Church held the ultimate spiritual weapon, excommunication's terror. For medieval women, being cast out from the Church was not merely a loss of religious privileges, it was a profound social death, severing them from community, spiritual solace, and the very hope of salvation. Instilling an acute and pervasive fear, imagine the absolute silence that would descend upon you if you were excommunicated. No priest would speak to you, no one would greet you in the street, and you would be barred from receiving the sacraments, the very lifeline to salvation in the medieval world. You couldn't be married in the Church, your children couldn't be baptized, and when you died, you faced the terrifying prospect of burial in unconsecrated ground, signifying eternal damnation. It's like having your entire social media presence erased, your bank accounts frozen, and your eternal soul unceremoniously unfriended. All in one go. One mainstream historical fact is that excommunication effectively stripped an individual of their social and legal standing within a deeply Christian society. It often meant economic ruin, as people were forbidden from trading with the excommunicated, and political ostracism, as rulers might avoid contact. For women, who often relied heavily on community networks for support, this isolation was particularly devastating. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval chronicles recount instances where entire villages would shun an excommunicated person so completely that they would even refuse to sell them food or water, literally starving them into submission or repentance. The communal fear of incurring the Church's wrath by associating with the excommunicated was powerful. Imagine trying to buy a loaf of bread, and every baker in town suddenly forgets how to count money. Historians still argue whether the extreme social consequences of excommunication were a deliberate policy to enforce conformity or an organic outcome of deep religious belief among the populace. The fear for medieval women centered on the absolute power of this spiritual sentence. Excommunication was often wielded by local bishops or even the Pope for various offenses, from heresy to defying church authority on marriage, debt, or property. For women, who might have less direct recourse to powerful secular advocates, facing such a sentence could feel utterly hopeless. Furthermore, the threat of excommunication could be used to enforce patriarchal control. A priest might threaten excommunication for disobedience to a husband, for practicing unorthodox remedies, or for engaging in activities deemed immodest. This weaponization of spiritual power meant that defiance, even in the face of injustice, carried the highest possible spiritual stakes. Thus, the terror of excommunication cast a chilling shadow over the lives of medieval women. It represented the ultimate spiritual and social banishment, a fate so dire that it compelled obedience and instilled a profound, pervasive fear of stepping outside the strict, unforgiving boundaries set by the Church. Following the ultimate threat of excommunication, let's explore a more subtle, yet constant, source of fear for medieval women: the moral policing of dress. The Church, ever vigilant about outward appearances as reflections of inner piety, often dictated what women should wear, creating anxiety about immodesty, vanity, and the perceived spiritual dangers of their own attire. Imagine preparing for Sunday Mass. You're not just choosing what makes you feel good, you're navigating an unwritten code of what is deemed acceptable, modest, and pious. The length of your sleeves, the cut of your neckline, the elaborateness of your head covering, all could be subjects of scrutiny, not just by your neighbors, but by your priest. The fear was that your clothing, however innocently chosen, could be interpreted as an invitation to sin, either for yourself or for men. It's like having a fashion advisor whose main critique is whether your outfit will accidentally lead someone to eternal damnation. 1. Mainstream. Historical fact is that medieval sermons and moral treatises frequently condemned female vanity and immodest dress. Preachers railed against elaborate hairstyles, revealing necklines, and excessive jewelry, equating them with pride, lust, and the temptations of the flesh. These condemnations were not just abstract. They aimed to shape daily behavior and reinforce a strict code of modesty for women. A quirky tidbit: some local church, synods, or individual bishops would issue specific guidelines on female dress, sometimes even dictating what colors were acceptable, or forbidding certain types of ornamentation for women of lower social standing. Imagine a village where the priest has a color chart of acceptable clothing, and your favorite shade of red is suddenly declared a gateway to perdition. Historians still argue whether the church's intense focus on female dress was primarily about moral purity or an attempt to maintain social hierarchy and control public displays of wealth. The fear for medieval women stemmed from the constant risk of misinterpretation. What one woman considered a respectable gown, another, or more importantly, a judgmental cleric, might deem provocatively immodest. This created a profound anxiety around self-presentation, a worry that even an innocent choice of clothing could lead to public rebuke, a scolding from the pulpit, or even a call for penance during confession. Furthermore, the emphasis on plain, humble dress implicitly tied a woman's spiritual worth to her lack of adornment. To be too concerned with one's appearance was a sign of worldly attachment, a distraction from piety. This put women in a difficult position. Their attire was a necessary aspect of social life, but simultaneously a potential trap for their souls. Thus, the Church's pervasive moral policing of dress instilled a subtle but constant fear in medieval women. Their choices in clothing were imbued with spiritual significance, making everyday attire a potential source of scrutiny, judgment, and a nagging worry about inadvertently inciting sin or displeasing God through their outward appearance. Beyond the sartorial dictates, the Church's influence over education access control created another, more profound fear for medieval women, the fear of intellectual limitation and the suppression of their inherent capacities. While the Church sometimes offered avenues for learning, it largely held the keys to knowledge, carefully controlling who could access it and to what extent, particularly for women. Imagine yourself as a bright young woman with a thirst for knowledge, perhaps listening intently to the priest's Latin readings, wishing you could understand more. Formal education, especially beyond basic religious instruction, was a rare commodity in the Middle Ages. For boys, there were monastic schools, cathedral schools, and eventually universities. For girls, the opportunities were significantly scarcer and often filtered through a very specific, church-approved lens. It's like living in a world where libraries exist, but the librarians only let half the population through the door, and even then, only to read prayer books. One mainstream historical fact is that convents were virtually the only institutions offering formal education for women in the medieval period. Nuns learned to read, often Latin, to understand scripture and liturgical texts. Some convents had impressive libraries and scriptoria, fostering intellectual life among their inhabitants. However, this access was often conditional on taking religious vows, and the curriculum was heavily geared towards spiritual instruction rather than secular knowledge. A quirky tidbit: some wealthy noblewomen might have had private tutors or received instruction in reading and writing, but this was a privilege, not a norm, and often focused on managing household accounts or reading devotional texts. Imagine being one of the few women who could read and write, using your skills not to pen philosophical treatises, but to meticulously track your family's cheese consumption. Historians still argue whether the Church's restriction on female education was primarily about maintaining social order or a genuine belief in women's intellectual inferiority. The fear for medieval women regarding education stemmed from this limited access. It was the fear of being intellectually stunted, of being unable to fully engage with theological concepts, or to read the very scriptures that dictated their lives. This created a dependency on male clerics for interpretation and instruction, reinforcing their subordinate position within the spiritual hierarchy. Furthermore, secular education was even more restricted. Women were generally excluded from universities and legal training, hindering their ability to pursue professions that required literacy or specialized knowledge. This lack of access meant fewer opportunities for independent livelihoods beyond the manual trades we discussed earlier, trapping many women in cycles of domestic labor or dependency. The Church, by largely controlling the avenues of formal learning, implicitly limited women's intellectual and professional horizons. Thus, the Church's control over education access instilled a quiet but profound fear in medieval women, the fear of intellectual stagnation, of being denied the tools to fully understand their faith or navigate the complexities of their world, ultimately reinforcing their reliance on male authority for spiritual and worldly guidance. Following the control over education, let's examine how the Church, through its powerful platform of sermons and stereotypes, actively reinforced negative portrayals of women, often instilling fear and self-doubt. The words spoken from the pulpit weren't just religious instruction. They were powerful tools shaping public opinion and internalizing societal biases. Imagine sitting in the nave of your parish church, listening intently to the priest's Sunday sermon. He speaks of the virtues of humility and obedience, drawing examples from biblical figures. But then, almost imperceptibly, the tone shifts. He might warn against the dangers of female vanity, the seductive power of women's beauty, or perhaps recount cautionary tales of disobedient wives or foolish virgins. These weren't just abstract lessons. They were reflections of pervasive stereotypes, delivered with divine authority aimed directly at you. It's like attending a motivational seminar that simultaneously manages to subtly blame your entire gender for all of humanity's problems. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval sermons frequently drew upon misogynistic tropes derived from classical texts. Early church fathers and interpretations of biblical narratives like Eve's fall. Women were often depicted as physically weaker, intellectually inferior, more prone to lust, and inherently prone to temptation. These messages were pervasive, reaching every corner of society. A quirky tidbit: some preachers would even use vivid, almost theatrical, imagery in their sermons to condemn female behavior, describing the tortures awaiting gossips in hell or the punishments for a modest dress. These dramatic pronouncements were designed to instill fear and enforce moral conformity. Imagine hearing a detailed description of demons, ripping out tongues for excessive chatter. It certainly makes you think twice before sharing a juicy rumor. Historians still argue whether the extreme rhetoric in these sermons reflected genuine clerical anxieties about female morality or was a strategic effort to exert control over a powerful segment of the population. The fear for medieval women stemmed from the constant exposure to these negative stereotypes, presented as divine truth. It created a profound psychological burden, a nagging doubt about their own inherent goodness, a sense that their natural inclinations were somehow sinful, and an acute awareness that their every action was being judged through a lens of suspicion. This internalized fear could lead to self-policing, as women strived to avoid fitting the negative archetypes so frequently condemned. Furthermore, these sermons also reinforced patriarchal hierarchies, presenting female submission and obedience to male authority fathers, husbands, priests, as divinely ordained. Any deviation from this prescribed role could be framed as a rejection of God's will, adding a spiritual dimension to defiance. Thus, the Church's powerful platform of sermons served as a constant reminder of societal and theological biases against women. By perpetuating negative stereotypes and emphasizing female failings, it instilled a deep and pervasive fear, pushing medieval women towards conformity and obedience, lest they fall prey to divine displeasure and earthly condemnation. In stark contrast to the negative stereotypes, the Church also presented an ultimate, yet paradoxical, path for exceptional women, sainthood's paradox. While offering the highest spiritual honor, the arduous and often painful journey to becoming a saint could be a source of profound fear for medieval women, demanding extreme asceticism, suffering, and a complete renunciation of worldly life, pushing them to the very limits of human endurance. Imagine striving for spiritual perfection in a world where piety often meant intense physical penance. You might fast for days, wear rough hair shirts against your skin, or spend hours kneeling on cold stone until your knees ache. For you, a medieval woman, the path to sainthood wasn't about comfortable contemplation. It was a brutal physical and spiritual marathon, and the fear was that your human frailty might prevent you from achieving the divine favor required. It's like entering an ultramarathon, where the finish line is heaven, and the training involves self-flagellation and talking to invisible beings. One mainstream historical fact is that female saints often achieved renown through extreme ascetic practices, mystical visions, and miraculous events, rather than through formal theological scholarship or ecclesiastical power, which were largely male domains. Figures like Saint Clare of Assisi or Saint Elizabeth of Hungary embraced radical poverty and self-denial, setting a powerful but incredibly demanding example for other women. A quirky tidbit: some female mystics and holy women experienced phenomena like stigmata, the appearance of Christ's wounds, or prolonged fasts, which were seen as signs of divine favor, but also often led to intense scrutiny from church authorities. These women lived on a knife edge, constantly needing to prove the divine origin of their experiences, lest they be accused of heresy or delusion. Imagine enduring incredible pain, only to then face an inquisition about whether your suffering is truly from God or just a very elaborate trick. Historians still argue whether the Church's promotion of female asceticism provided a rare avenue for female agency and influence, or simply channeled female spiritual energy into self-punishing. The fear for women pursuing sainthood was multi-layered. Firstly, the physical rigor. Many saints pushed their bodies to the breaking point, enduring extreme privation that today we would recognize as severe self-harm or eating disorders. The fear was of failing these tests of endurance, of proving too weak to merit divine grace. Secondly, the spiritual scrutiny. Claims of visions, miracles, or direct communication with God were not always welcomed by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. These experiences needed to be carefully validated by male authorities, and often suspicion of heresy or deception loomed large. A wrong word, a misinterpreted vision, could turn veneration into persecution. Finally, the renunciation of worldly life was absolute. Sainthood often required a complete detachment from family, possessions, and all earthly comforts. For a woman, this meant embracing a radical form of independence that simultaneously isolated her from the very human connections she might crave. Thus, while sainthood offered the ultimate spiritual glory for medieval women, it was a paradoxical path fraught with fear. It demanded superhuman endurance, constant spiritual vigilance, and the terrifying risk of failing to meet an impossibly high standard, all under the watchful and often skeptical eye of the male-dominated church. Moving from the extreme demands of sainthood, let's consider a much more common life stage for many medieval women: widowhood and remarriage. While the church offered widows a degree of legal autonomy, its complex stance on their choices, particularly regarding remarriage, could instill a quiet fear of social pressure, economic vulnerability, or spiritual disapproval. Imagine you've recently lost your husband. The period of mourning is over, and now you face a crucial decision. Do you remain a widow, perhaps managing your late husband's property and enjoying a newfound independence, remember the femme sole status, or do you remarry, potentially losing that autonomy but gaining the security of a new husband? The church, while recognizing your legal rights as a widow, also had very specific ideas about the spiritual implications of your choice, making it a source of both opportunity and apprehension. It's like being offered two different retirement plans, one that grants you independence, but with a lot of hidden fees, and another that's stable but means you lose all control of your assets. One mainstream historical fact is that the church generally encouraged widows to remain unmarried, particularly if they were older, seeing perpetual widowhood as a more pious and virtuous state. St. Paul's advice in the New Testament, it is good for them to stay unmarried, just as I do, was often emphasized, portraying chaste widowhood as a path to greater spiritual merit and dedication to God. A quirky tidbit: some wealthy widows, especially those without surviving male heirs, chose to remain unmarried to retain full control over their inherited property and economic affairs. They became significant figures in local economies, running businesses or managing estates that would otherwise have passed to male relatives upon remarriage. Imagine being the richest woman in town, and everyone keeps subtly pushing you towards a new husband, but you're too busy counting your profits. Historians still argue whether the church's encouragement of perpetual widowhood was genuinely spiritual guidance, or a pragmatic way to channel wealthy women's resources into charitable donations upon their death. The fear for medieval widows often stemmed from the societal and spiritual pressure surrounding remarriage. While not forbidden, a second marriage was often seen as less spiritually pure than continued widowhood. You might face subtle disapproval from priests or community members if you chose to remarry, particularly if your first marriage had been short or childless. There was the underlying fear of being judged for worldly desires over spiritual devotion. Economically, remaining a widow could be empowering, as it granted control over your dower lands or inherited property. However, it also meant you were solely responsible for your own upkeep and defense, without a husband's protection. Remarrying offered security, but meant surrendering much of that hard-won independence. The Church, by framing perpetual widowhood as a virtue, subtly added a layer of spiritual pressure to an already complex decision. Thus, while widowhood offered medieval women a unique window of autonomy, their choices regarding remarriage were often shadowed by fear. The Church's spiritual encouragement of perpetual widowhood, coupled with societal expectations and economic realities, made the decision a weighty one, fraught with anxieties about status, security, and eternal salvation. From the complexities of widowhood, let's pivot to a deeply uncomfortable, yet unavoidable, aspect of medieval urban life and the Church's involvement: prostitution and regulation. While technically a sin, the Church often reluctantly acknowledged its existence, leading to a complex web of fear for women forced into or trapped by this profession. Caught between societal condemnation and the Church's attempts at control, imagine a shadowy alleyway in a bustling medieval town, or a designated district set apart from the respectable streets. For some women, particularly those driven by extreme poverty, lack of family support, or coercion, prostitution became a desperate means of survival. The Church, while condemning the act as gravely sinful, also recognized it as a necessary evil to protect the virtue of other women. This paradoxical stance meant you were living in a constant state of fear: fear of damnation, fear of disease, fear of violence, and fear of the very authorities who both tolerated and condemned your existence. It's like working in a job that's technically illegal, constantly looking over your shoulder, while the people in charge occasionally send you a very stern letter reminding you of your moral failings. One mainstream historical fact is that many medieval towns, often with the implicit or explicit approval of local church authorities, established regulated prostitution districts or brothels. This was an attempt to contain and control what was seen as an inevitable vice, rather than eliminate it entirely. These regulated zones were often near city walls or outside the main thoroughfares, keeping them at arm's length from respectable society. A quirky tidbit: some medieval brothels were even run by convents or benevolent organizations, with profits purportedly going to charity or the upkeep of religious institutions. This incredibly morally ambiguous situation highlights the Church's complex and often hypocritical relationship with prostitution. Imagine living in a brothel that's technically owned by a group of nuns. It certainly adds a layer of existential dread to your workday. Historians still argue whether the Church's regulation of prostitution was a pragmatic solution to social problems or an exploitation of vulnerable women under the guise of order. The fear for medieval women engaged in prostitution was multifaceted. Firstly, the spiritual fear, being constantly reminded that their profession was a mortal sin, ensuring eternal damnation unless they truly repented. The threat of hellfire was very real. Secondly, the physical dangers: violence from clients, exploitation by brothel keepers, and the constant threat of disease in an era without effective medicine. Thirdly, the social ostracism. Despite official regulation, prostitutes were often marginalized and looked down upon, denied respectability, and often stripped of family ties. They lived on the fringes, always vulnerable to public shame or arbitrary crackdowns. The Church, while allowing the existence of brothels, did little to alleviate the spiritual or social burden on the women themselves, offering only the path of conversion and repentance, which often led to a life of destitution or entry into Magdalene asylums, institutions for reformed prostitutes, often strict and punitive. Thus, for medieval women, the existence of prostitution, tolerated yet condemned by the Church, created a terrifying dilemma. It was a life of constant fear, spiritual, physical, and social, with little hope of escape or genuine redemption, within a society that both used and reviled them. Moving from the grim realities of prostitution, let's explore a broader limitation imposed by the Church. Sacraments denied or limited for medieval women. While sacraments were the very lifeblood of spiritual existence, certain theological interpretations and traditional practices often placed women in a position of lesser access or diminished participation, fostering a quiet, pervasive fear of spiritual inadequacy. Imagine attending a religious ceremony, perhaps a baptism or a priestly ordination. You witness the sacred rites, the blessings, the transformative power of God's grace flowing through the hands of a priest. But you also know, deeply and intrinsically, that some of these holy moments are not meant for you, or that your participation is restricted. For you, a medieval woman, this wasn't about personal exclusion. It was a constant reminder of your perceived spiritual inferiority, a fear that you could never fully embody the divine presence in the same way as a man. It's like being at a banquet where everyone else gets a full meal, but you're only allowed to sample the appetizers, and only on certain days. One mainstream historical fact is that women were strictly excluded from receiving the sacrament of holy orders, ordination to the priesthood. This was a foundational principle of the medieval Church, based on theological interpretations that held women could not represent Christ in the same way as men. This exclusion meant women could never celebrate Mass, hear confessions, or administer most sacraments, fundamentally limiting their role within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. A quirky tidbit, while not explicitly denied, women's access to communion might sometimes be less frequent or subject to stricter rules, especially during menstruation or after childbirth. Remember those purity taboos. Some local customs also required women to receive communion on their knees at the altar rail, whereas men might stand or kneel differently. Imagine having to navigate a whole set of unspoken rules just to receive the body of Christ, always wondering if you're doing it right. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were primarily theological, stemming from ancient purity codes, or a means of reinforcing patriarchal control within the Church. The fear for medieval women stemmed from this subtle but persistent spiritual marginalization. While baptism and marriage were open to them, the most powerful and transformative sacraments, holy orders, and by extension, the full performance of Mass, remained perpetually beyond their reach. This created an unconscious anxiety about their spiritual efficacy, a feeling that they were always secondary participants in the divine drama. Furthermore, issues surrounding confession, as we've explored, could also limit access, as priests might impose penances that temporarily barred a woman from communion. The delicate balance between a woman's perceived sinfulness and her desire for spiritual nourishment created a constant tension, a fear of being unworthy or unable to fully engage with God's grace. Thus, the Church's limitations on women's access to certain sacraments, particularly their exclusion from the priesthood, fostered a deep-seated fear of spiritual inadequacy. It reinforced their subordinate position within the religious sphere, creating a pervasive anxiety about their capacity for holiness and their ultimate path to salvation. Beyond the spiritual nuances, the Church's formidable presence extended into the legal sphere, meaning that church courts' reach impacted the daily lives of medieval women in profound ways, often generating fear through their jurisdiction over moral, marital, and even some property disputes. These ecclesiastical tribunals could dictate a woman's social standing, her family life, and her very reputation. Imagine receiving a summons to appear before a church court. This isn't a royal court or a local lord's judgment. This is the spiritual arm of authority, dealing with matters of faith, morality, and family law. For you, a medieval woman, this could be terrifying. These courts might investigate accusations of adultery, challenge the legitimacy of your marriage, rule on inheritance. If it involved a church office, or even compel you to fulfill a marriage contract you no longer desired. It's like having your private life put on trial by a group of highly judgmental theologians, and their verdict can ruin your entire existence. One mainstream historical fact is that church courts, ecclesiastical courts, held wide jurisdiction over matters concerning marriage, wills especially where they touched on religious bequests, oaths, legitimacy, and sexual morality. This meant that disputes involving a woman's marital status, her dowry rights, or accusations of fornication or slander often fell under the purview of these courts, giving them immense power over female lives. A quirky tidbit: some women actively used church courts to their advantage, particularly in cases of marital separation where they sought to prove their husband's cruelty or neglect, or to reclaim dowry property that had been wrongfully withheld. While often intimidating, these courts sometimes offered women a unique legal avenue, not always available in secular courts. Imagine taking your abusive husband to court and actually having a chance at a ruling in your favor, solely because the church cares about marital sanctity and property. Historians still argue whether the church courts, despite their patriarchal biases, offered more avenues for women to seek justice than secular legal systems of the time. The fear for medieval women stemmed from several factors. Firstly, the potential for public humiliation. Cases in church courts were often public, and accusations of moral failings could irrevocably damage a woman's reputation, leading to social ostracism and difficulty in finding future employment or marriage prospects. The church's emphasis on public penance could compound this shame. Secondly, the arbitrary nature of some rulings. While canon law existed, local interpretation and the biases of individual judges could significantly influence outcomes. Without legal representation, a concept very different from today and often less education, women might struggle to present their cases effectively. Finally, the spiritual consequences. Disobeying a church court's ruling could lead to excommunication, the gravest spiritual punishment. This added an immense layer of pressure, as legal defeat in an ecclesiastical court could literally imperil your soul, creating a constant, profound dread. Thus, the pervasive reach of church courts instilled a powerful fear in medieval women. Their jurisdiction over matters so central to a woman's life, her marriage, her morality, her very standing in the community, meant that a summons to an ecclesiastical tribunal was a terrifying prospect, a moment when her spiritual and social fate hung precariously in the balance. Beyond the explicit rulings of church courts, the daily lives of medieval women were also influenced by the blurring lines between formal doctrine and popular belief, particularly in the realm of superstition and faith. The church often struggled to control localized spiritual practices, and for women, This created a fear of inadvertently crossing into forbidden territory, risking condemnation for beliefs or actions that seemed innocuous but were deemed unchristian. Imagine a rustic village, far from the grand cathedrals, where ancient traditions blend with Christian faith. You might tie a knot in a ribbon for luck, use a specific chant to ensure fertility, or consult a local charm worker for a simple ailment. These practices, passed down through generations, were part of your lived reality. But then comes the priest, warning against idolatry or pagan remnants, threatening divine wrath for those who put faith in anything other than God and His church. It's like using a perfectly functional, older operating system, only to be constantly lectured by the tech support hotline about how it's spiritually corrupt and will cause your computer to spontaneously combust. One mainstream historical fact is that local folk, customs, and beliefs often coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with official church doctrine throughout the Middle Ages. While the church worked to Christianize pre-Christian practices, many ancient superstitions, rituals, and beliefs in magical remedies persisted, particularly in rural areas and among women who were often the keepers of such traditions. A quirky tidbit: some medieval saints' lives describe holy men or women performing miracles that were essentially highly dramatic versions of common folk remedies, which the church then sanctioned as divine intervention. This allowed the church to absorb popular belief while simultaneously controlling the narrative and condemning similar practices when performed by unapproved individuals. Imagine seeing a priest bless a specific herb to cure a fever, while simultaneously condemning your grandmother for using the same herb without his blessing. Historians still argue whether the Church's attempts to suppress superstition were genuine theological purges or a means to consolidate its monopoly on spiritual power and healing. The fear for medieval women stemmed from this constant tightrope walk between accepted faith and condemned superstition. A simple act of popular piety could, in the wrong light or by the wrong interpretation, be deemed heretical or even witchcraft. This created anxiety about one's spiritual integrity, a worry that everyday actions might unwittingly invite the Church's wrath. Furthermore, women were often seen as more susceptible to folly and superstition due to their perceived weaker intellect and emotional nature. Remember the stereotypes from sermons. This meant that practices that might be tolerated in men could be viewed with greater suspicion when performed by women, making them more vulnerable to accusations or censure. Thus, the blurred lines between superstition and faith instilled a subtle but persistent fear in medieval women. Their reliance on traditional practices, often essential for daily life and well-being, put them at risk of church disapproval, making every charm, every folk remedy, a potential step towards spiritual condemnation and earthly punishment. As our journey through the medieval mind draws to a close, it's time to consolidate our understanding of fear's enduring legacy for medieval women. What began as theological principles filtered down into daily life, manifesting in a complex, multifaceted apprehension that shaped their experiences, choices, and their very perception of self within a church-dominated world. Imagine, one last time, the medieval woman, her life intricately woven into the Church's vast tapestry. From the moment of her birth, burdened by the legacy of Eve and original sin, remember that pervasive theological shadow, to the very end of her days, where salvation hinged on church teachings. Her existence was defined and delimited by ecclesiastical authority. Her fear was not a single, isolated emotion, but a persistent undercurrent, sometimes sharp and terrifying, like the threat of the Inquisition. sometimes subtle and insidious, like the pressure to conform to impossible ideals of purity. 1. Mainstream historical fact to carry with you is that the Church, despite its many beneficial roles, providing charity, education in convents, and moral guidance, fundamentally operated within a patriarchal framework that often positioned women as subordinate and more susceptible to sin. This inherent bias, embedded in theology, law, and practice, was the root cause of much of the fear we've discussed. A quirky tidbit that sums up this complex dynamic: even as the Church condemned female weakness, it paradoxically celebrated women who defied it through extreme piety or miraculous acts, suggesting a deep internal conflict within its own view of gender. It's like a coach who constantly tells you you're terrible at sports, but then throws a party if you manage to hit a single home run. Historians still argue whether the medieval Church was primarily a force of oppression or liberation for women, or if its impact was too varied to categorize simply. Her fear was of spiritual damnation, the ultimate terror in an age of faith. It was the fear of public shame, of social ostracism, enforced by a community deeply influenced by church moralizing. It was the fear of physical vulnerability, amplified by the Church's often limited protections and its focus on female purity. And it was the fear of intellectual and personal confinement, as educational access and societal roles were heavily curated by ecclesiastical norms. Yet, amidst this fear, women found incredible resilience. They navigated these treacherous waters with remarkable strength, forging communities, practicing quiet defiance, and finding avenues for spiritual and practical agency where they could. They understood the power dynamic, and while they might have feared the Church's judgment, many also clung to its promise of salvation, seeking solace and strength within its complex embrace. Their relationship with the Church was a dance between apprehension and devotion, between submission and subtle resistance. So, as you finally drift off, let the echoes of these medieval women fade. Feel the quietness gather around you, a gentle hum in the stillness. There's nothing more to do, nothing left to worry about. Just ease into the silence, let your breathing deepen, and allow yourself to gently release the day. All is calm, all is safe.